You're not crazy for feeling jealous, but reacting fast is what causes damage. Here's the sentence that slows everything down. I'm noticing a story, not a fact. Say it once. Don't explain it. It stops you from sending the text you regret and gives your nervous system time to settle. This sentence changes the dynamic, but what you do after saying it is what really matters. That's explained in today's Stoic Focus Lab episode. You're on your phone on a Sunday night, half watching a show you don't really care about, half staring at the last message thread on your screen. The message says seen, but there's no reply. Your body reacts before your mind does. Your chest tightens. Your jaw sets. Your thoughts start racing, not in full sentences, but in flashes, a tone from earlier, a laugh that feels slightly off, a pause that suddenly feels loaded. Nothing concrete has happened, but your nervous system is already acting like something has gone very wrong. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people don't want to hear. Jealousy doesn't begin with betrayal, flirting, or disrespect. It begins with the stories you tell yourself in the absence of clear information. Here's your immediate micro-win. Say this exact sentence to yourself: I'm noticing a story, not a fact. When you say it, you interrupt the momentum of the spiral for the next 10 minutes. You don't magically feel calm, but you stop escalating. You give your body just enough space to slow down. That pause often means you don't send the passive-aggressive text, you don't start scrolling for evidence, and you don't rehearse an argument that hasn't actually been invited yet. Educational content inspired by classical Stoic texts. Not medical, psychological, financial, or legal advice. Let's name what's really happening, without sugarcoating it. Jealousy feels urgent, but it's rarely about the present moment. It's about fear projected into the future. And the cost shows up everywhere. At work, it hijacks your focus and turns neutral feedback into imagined threats. With money, it fuels comparison, resentment, and a constant sense of falling behind. In relationships, it quietly shifts you from being present to being vigilant. You start tracking behavior instead of sharing space. You listen less and assume more. Over time, that costs you trust, emotional safety, and real intimacy. The clearest cost is this: jealousy pulls you out of your life and traps you inside your head. What makes this worse is that most people think jealousy is something you either have or don't have. They treat it like a personality flaw or a sign of love, instead of what it actually is, a mental habit. A fast, protective pattern that evolved to keep you from being blindsided, but now fires too often and too inaccurately. When you don't know how to work with it, it starts running your behavior for you. By the end of this lesson, you'll have 3 concrete abilities you can use immediately. You'll be able to separate real signals from imagined meaning while the emotion is still active, not hours later. You'll know how to talk about insecurity without blaming, interrogating, or trying to control the other person. And you'll start building a deeper sense of internal security that doesn't depend on constant reassurance, checking, or emotional monitoring. If calmer conversations, fewer spirals, and more self-respect inside your relationships matter to you, this channel is designed for exactly that kind of work. Stay with me until the very end, and while you're here, hit like, tap subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Here's the path we're taking today. First, you'll learn how to slow the moment jealousy hits so urgency can't hijack your behavior. Next, you'll practice separating observable facts from the stories your mind automatically fills in. Then, you'll learn a way to speak insecurity out loud that invites clarity instead of conflict. Finally, you'll see how all of this comes together in a real-life situation that usually ends in overthinking, distance, or regret. And before we move forward, let me open a loop that will matter later. There's a very specific moment that triggers jealousy more than almost anything else, a delayed response combined with a subtle shift in tone. Most people either confront too aggressively or withdraw completely there. Later in this lesson, we're going to return to that exact moment and walk through how to handle it without losing your balance, your dignity, or the connection itself. Here's the microscript to use the moment jealousy shows up. What did I actually observe, and what am I adding? Say it once, quietly, even under your breath. That single question creates separation between reality and interpretation. It doesn't solve the emotion, but it stops you from confusing perception with proof. This works because the mind hates uncertainty. When information is incomplete, your brain fills the gap automatically, usually with the most emotionally charged explanation available. Not because it's accurate, but because it feels protective. Jealousy thrives in that gap. By asking what you actually observed, you force your mind to slow down and label inputs instead of conclusions. You move from imagination back to evidence, which gives your nervous system something solid to stand on. Picture a familiar North American moment. You're finishing a late workday, Slack finally quiet, and you notice your partner liked someone's photo online but hasn't responded to your message from an hour ago. The old pattern kicks in fast. Your chest tightens. Your mind jumps ahead. They're more interested in someone else. You're being taken for granted. Something is shifting. None of those are observations. The observation is simple and almost boring. A like happened, a reply hasn't yet. Everything else is a story layered on top. The mistake most people make here is arguing with the story. They tell themselves they shouldn't feel jealous, or they start gathering counter-evidence in their head. That usually backfires. The emotion feels dismissed, so it pushes harder. This microscript doesn't argue. It separates. It says, let's put facts on one side and meaning on the other. That alone reduces intensity. Here's a tiny action you can take today. The next time jealousy hits, write down 3 short phrases, even in your notes app. 1 line for what you directly saw or heard. 1 line for what you're assuming it means. 1 line for what you don't actually know yet. Keep each line under 10 words. This turns a vague emotional surge into something concrete and manageable. Most people are surprised by how thin the facts column actually is. Now slow this down for a moment. Take a breath in through your nose for 4 seconds, and let it out for 6. While you breathe, notice where jealousy shows up in your body. Maybe it's a tight stomach, a buzzing chest, or clenched shoulders. You're not trying to relax. You're just noticing it without feeding it new thoughts. This matters because when the body feels seen, it doesn't need to escalate to get your attention. As you practice this, something subtle shifts. You start catching the story earlier. Instead of being fully inside the spiral, you're standing slightly beside it, watching it form. That position gives you choice. You might still decide to ask a question or express discomfort, but you're doing it from clarity, not panic. This also protects the relationship in ways people don't expect. When you act on stories, you tend to accuse, test, or withdraw. Even if you don't say much, your tone changes. The other person feels it and gets defensive or confused, which then feels like confirmation of your fear. Separating facts from stories interrupts that loop before it hardens. Notice how this connects to the earlier open loop about delayed replies. The delay itself is a fact. The meaning you assign to it is optional. When you can hold that distinction, the moment loses some of its grip. You don't need to resolve everything immediately. You just need to stop adding fuel. This isn't about suppressing jealousy or pretending you don't care. It's about accuracy. Jealousy fed by facts leads to useful conversations. Jealousy fed by stories leads to regret. The difference starts with one calm question, asked at the exact moment your mind wants to rush ahead. You're in the car, stopped at a red light, replaying a conversation that ended an hour ago. It was short, maybe even normal, but something about it didn't sit right. A response felt clipped. A joke didn't land. Now your mind is building a case, piece by piece, as if you're preparing for a trial only you know is happening. By the time the light turns green, you're already emotionally braced for conflict that hasn't actually arrived. The mistake in moments like this isn't feeling insecure. The mistake is treating insecurity like a verdict instead of a signal. When you assume the feeling itself means something is wrong, you skip curiosity and go straight to defense or control. Here's the correction, and it's simple but uncomfortable. Use this exact line when you speak, either to yourself first or out loud if needed. I'm feeling a bit insecure, and I don't want to guess what it means. That sentence does 2 things at once. It names the emotion without blaming, and it removes the pressure to immediately explain or justify it. You're not accusing. You're not asking for reassurance. You're setting a clean starting point. This works because most conflict around jealousy isn't about behavior, it's about implied intent. When you say, "You seem distant," or "Why didn't you reply?" you're already implying a motive. The other person hears a charge, even if you don't mean it that way. By contrast, naming your internal state without attaching it to their character or actions lowers defensiveness. It keeps the conversation in the present instead of dragging the past or future into it. Imagine a common North American evening. Dinner dishes are done, the TV is on low, and there's a subtle sense of space between you and your partner. Normally, this is where the old pattern would take over. You might probe with a loaded question, or you might go quiet and cold, waiting to see if they notice. This time, you pause. You say the line, calmly. No build-up. No explanation. Just the truth of your experience. Here's the tiny action to practice today. Once in the next 24 hours, say that sentence to yourself in full, even if you don't say it to anyone else. Notice how different it feels to acknowledge insecurity without immediately attaching a story or solution. That internal practice matters because it trains you to tolerate uncertainty without filling it with assumptions. Now for a brief pattern interrupt. Drop your shoulders. Unclench your jaw. Take one slow breath and ask yourself, am I trying to reduce discomfort or am I trying to understand? That question resets your intention. Reducing discomfort often leads to control. Understanding leads to connection. Over time, this changes how insecurity shows up in your life. Instead of being something you hide or act out, it becomes something you can hold openly. You stop outsourcing your sense of safety to someone else's behavior. And when you do choose to speak, your words land differently. They invite clarity instead of conflict. This also ties back to what we're building here. When you separate facts from stories and then name insecurity without accusation, you create a narrow, honest channel for communication. You're no longer asking the other person to manage your fear, and you're not pretending you don't have any. You're standing in the middle, which is where real trust grows. Later, we're going to stress test this approach in a situation where emotions run high and time pressure is real. For now, notice how simply changing the way you frame your inner experience can prevent hours, or even days, of unnecessary distance. One of the most damaging beliefs about jealousy is this: if you don't act on it quickly, you'll lose leverage or miss the truth. That belief keeps people in a constant state of urgency, as if every uncomfortable feeling is an emergency that demands immediate expression. Under pressure, that myth feels convincing. In reality, urgency is what makes jealousy unreliable. Here's the clear instruction that cuts through that belief: you do not need to resolve insecurity at the same speed it appears. You need to slow it before you speak. The stakes here are high. When you speak from urgency, your words come out sharper than you intend or quieter than you should. You either push too hard or disappear. Both damage trust. Slowing down isn't avoidance, it's accuracy. It's the difference between reacting to a fear and responding to reality. Use this exact script when pressure is high: I'm not ready to talk about this clearly yet. I want to slow it down so I don't say the wrong thing. That sentence buys you time without shutting the door. It signals care, not withdrawal. And most importantly, it prevents you from turning a temporary emotional spike into a lasting relational wound. Why this works is simple. Under stress, your brain prioritizes threat detection over nuance. Blood flow shifts. Your ability to interpret tone, context, and intent drops. When you force a conversation in that state, you're operating with reduced clarity and heightened suspicion. By slowing the moment, you allow your nervous system to settle enough for perspective to return. You're not suppressing the issue. You're choosing a better moment to address it. Picture a real scenario. You're out with friends, and you notice your partner laughing a little too easily with someone else. It's loud, crowded, and there's alcohol in the mix. Your body reacts instantly. Heat rises in your chest. Your mind starts narrating. The myth says you should confront it now, before it gets worse. Old, you might pull them aside, make a comment that sounds like a joke but isn't, or withdraw and stew for the rest of the night. This time, you do something different. You notice the surge and you don't act on it immediately. You use the script internally first. You remind yourself that clarity doesn't come from urgency. You stay present, finish the evening, and let your body settle. Later, in a quieter moment, you revisit what actually happened. Often, the intensity has already dropped by half. What felt undeniable earlier now looks more ambiguous, sometimes even harmless. Let's slow this down with a brief practice. Sit where you are and feel your feet against the floor. Take one slow breath in and a longer breath out. As you exhale, imagine lowering the volume knob on the situation by just 10%. Not muting it. Just lowering it. Notice how even a small reduction changes your internal posture. You're less braced, more upright, more capable of choice. This is where many people worry they're letting things slide. They're not. They're choosing timing. Stoic thinking emphasizes that events themselves don't disturb us as much as our judgments about them. When you delay action, you're not ignoring the event, you're questioning the judgment that says it must be handled now, in this exact emotional state. And here's the stress test insight most people miss. If a concern is valid, it will still be valid after you slow down. If it dissolves when urgency fades, it was likely driven more by fear than fact. Either way, you win. You either address a real issue with clarity, or you avoid creating a problem where none existed. This sets up what's coming next. We're about to walk through a situation where jealousy, time pressure, and uncertainty collide all at once. You'll see how slowing the moment, separating stories from facts, and naming insecurity without accusation work together when it actually counts. The goal isn't to never feel jealous. It's to handle it in a way that protects your self-respect and the relationship at the same time. It's a Thursday night, and you're home later than usual. The house is quiet except for the low hum of the dishwasher. You drop your bag, check your phone, and see a short message from your partner that came hours ago. Neutral words. No emoji. No follow-up. Your chest tightens before you even finish reading it. Your mind starts moving fast, pulling in earlier details, a distracted tone this morning, a busy schedule this week, that laugh you heard in the background on a call yesterday. The old reaction is right there, ready. You can feel it lining up a confrontation or a cold withdrawal. You pause. Not because you're calm, but because you remember the first tool. You quietly ask yourself what you actually observed and what you're adding. The observation is simple, a short message, sent earlier, no reply since. Everything else is interpretation. You don't argue with the feeling. You just separate it. The intensity drops a notch. Not gone, but manageable. You start to type a message anyway. It's halfway accusatory, masked as casual. You stop. This is where the second tool almost slips. You can feel the urge to reduce discomfort by getting reassurance immediately. Instead, you delete the draft. You sit down at the kitchen table and take one slow breath, longer on the exhale. You notice the tightness in your stomach and let it be there without feeding it more thoughts. The silence feels uncomfortable, but it's not dangerous. When your partner gets home later, you feel the spike again. They seem tired, a little quiet. Normally, this is where you'd read meaning into every movement. Tonight, you don't pretend everything is fine, and you don't interrogate either. You use the third tool. Calmly, you say you're feeling a bit insecure and you don't want to guess what it means. You stop talking. No explanation. No evidence list. Just the truth of your internal state. There's a pause. It feels long. Your body wants to fill it. You stay still. This is the slow practice inside the moment. Feet on the floor. Shoulders down. One breath. Then another. Your partner responds, not defensively, but with curiosity. They explain the day ran longer than expected and they were mentally fried. Nothing dramatic. Nothing hidden. Just human fatigue. Here's where the old pattern almost reasserts itself. Part of you thinks that's too easy. Another part wants to dig, just to be sure. Instead, you check back in with facts. The explanation matches what you observed. There's no new information that contradicts it. You decide not to escalate something that's already settling. Later that night, you're lying in bed, and you notice something important. You're not replaying the evening. You're not drafting imaginary follow-up conversations. Your body feels calmer than usual after a moment that would normally spiral. That's the observable outcome. Not perfection, not certainty, but a calmer night and no emotional hangover. What changed wasn't your partner's behavior. It was your response. You slowed urgency. You separated the story from fact. You named insecurity without turning it into control. At each step, the old reaction tried to take over, and each time you gave yourself just enough space to choose differently. This is what the application looks like. Not a dramatic transformation, but a series of small interruptions that add up. You didn't suppress jealousy. You didn't shame yourself for feeling it. You worked with it. And because of that, the moment passed without damage. You protected your self-respect, and you preserved the connection instead of testing it. As you drift towards sleep, there's a subtle sense of trust, not just in the relationship, but in yourself. You handled a familiar trigger without losing your balance. That's not accidental. It's the result of practicing these tools when it counts, inside real life, where emotions are messy and timing is imperfect. What you've been practicing through this entire lesson is the difference between reacting and responding. Reacting is fast, automatic, and driven by the need to reduce discomfort immediately. Responding is slower, intentional, and guided by who you want to be after the moment passes. Jealousy doesn't vanish when you respond differently, but it loses authority. Instead of scattering your attention and pulling you into imagined futures, you bring yourself back into the present, where you actually have choice. First, we slowed the moment jealousy appeared so urgency couldn't hijack your behavior. You saw that most emotional damage doesn't come from what you feel, but from how fast you feel pressured to act. When you refused to resolve everything immediately, your nervous system had time to settle and your thinking became more accurate. Then, you learned to separate observable facts from the stories your mind automatically builds. That single distinction reduced intensity because it stopped fear from disguising itself as certainty. Next, you practiced naming insecurity without turning it into accusation, interrogation, or self-erasure. Instead of demanding reassurance or withdrawing, you learned to speak from honesty without attack. Finally, you watched all of those tools work together inside a real situation where the old reaction almost took over. It didn't. Not because the emotion was weaker, but because your response was stronger. Here's the lesson to lock in: jealousy becomes destructive when it's treated like a command instead of information. When you react, you hand your behavior over to fear and hope it leads you somewhere safe. When you respond, you stay present long enough to choose accuracy over urgency. That choice doesn't just protect the relationship. It protects your self-respect. You stop abandoning yourself in an attempt to feel secure. Now let's turn insight into action with exactly 3 things to do today. First, the next time jealousy spikes, pause before speaking or texting and separate facts from stories in real time. Do it out loud if you can, or write it in your notes app. Name what you directly observed in one short sentence, then name what you're assuming it means in another. If the assumption feels louder than the fact, that's your signal to wait. Even 2 minutes of separation can prevent hours of regret. Second, once today, practice naming insecurity without explanation. Say the sentence you learned earlier either internally or out loud, and stop there. Don't follow it with justification, evidence, or a request for reassurance. Notice the discomfort that comes from not filling the silence, and stay with it. That discomfort is where emotional independence starts to grow. You're teaching yourself that you can feel insecure without immediately trying to control the outcome. Third, intentionally slow one emotionally charged conversation by at least 20 minutes. Not to avoid it, not to suppress it, but to lower the intensity before engagement. During that time, regulate your body with one simple practice: inhale through your nose, exhale longer than you inhale. Let the urgency pass before you speak. When you return to the conversation, pay attention to how different your tone feels. That shift is the payoff. You're not calmer because the situation changed. You're calmer because you did. If you want to build on this work, the next lesson to watch focuses on boundaries and over-explaining, especially how insecurity quietly pushes you to say more than you should. A logical follow-up title is Boundaries Without Guilt: Stop Over-Explaining Yourself. It matters because jealousy and weak boundaries feed each other. When boundaries strengthen, insecurity loses leverage. When insecurity loses leverage, jealousy becomes easier to handle. Before we close, it's important to reframe what success looks like here. You didn't learn how to eliminate jealousy. You learned how to stay steady while it's present. That's the real skill. Calm isn't the absence of emotion, it's the ability to feel emotion without letting it dictate your behavior. When you stay calm, you're not disconnecting or becoming indifferent. You're staying grounded enough to choose how you respond instead of being dragged by your first impulse. Over time, this changes more than just individual moments. Conversations get cleaner because you're not loading them with unspoken fear. Nights get quieter because you're not replaying imagined threats. You trust yourself more, which paradoxically makes trusting others easier. You stop testing people to manage your anxiety. You stop punishing the present for futures that haven't happened yet. This approach isn't about perfection. You will still feel jealous. You will still misread moments sometimes. What changes is recovery time and damage. Spirals get shorter. Regret becomes rarer. And you begin to recognize the early signs of urgency as a cue to slow down, not speed up. If you practice nothing else from this lesson, practice the pause. That pause is where freedom lives. It's where choice replaces compulsion. It's where insecurity stops running the show and becomes just another sensation you know how to handle. If you feel messages like this need to reach more people, hit like, tap subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments.